Distinguished guests, Deputy Secretary General Amina J Mohammed, Prime Minister Katrín Jakobsdóttir, Guðmundur Ingi Guðbrandsson, Minister of Nordic Cooperation and Minister of Social Affairs and the Labour Market, Anne Beate Tvinnereim, Minister of Nordic Cooperation and Minister of International Development from Norway. Other distinguished guests, let me also mention the Mayor of Lviv, Andrei Sadov. We're very happy to have you here. Dear Nordic colleagues, dear friends, and guests from far and wide, good morning. Welcome to Harpa. Welcome to the Imagine Forum. My name is Pia Hansson. I'm Director of the Institute of International Affairs and also Höfði Reykjavík Peace Center. Before, I have the distinct honor and pleasure to invite the Prime Minister of Iceland to the stage for her opening remarks. I would like to draw your attention to my colleagues. You probably have seen them around, but I want to ask them to kind of wave a little bit. If you need any assistance, any information during the next 2 days, they are your go-to people. So that's very good to know. We have a highly interesting 2-day conference ahead of us. We have very serious and important issues to discuss, but it also needs to be enlightening and it needs to be interesting, and I encourage you to use the 2 days to get to know each other and to talk and to carry the dialogue further. If ever there was a time to talk about peace, that time has to be now. I now yield the floor to Katrín Jakobsdóttir, the Prime Minister of Iceland. Katrín has been Prime Minister of Iceland since 2017. She's been the chair of the Left-Green movement since 2013 and a member of Parliament since 2007. When her remarks are over, Guðmundur Ingi Guðbrandsson, Minister for Nordic Cooperation and Minister of Social Affairs and the Labour Market, will take the floor. Katrín, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pia. Secretary General Mohammed, dear Amina, Excellencies, Ministers, Mayor, dear friends, I'm very happy to welcome you to Iceland and Reykjavik on this rather dreary morning here in Reykjavik for the 8th Imagine Forum for Peace. And it's my hope that we will have meaningful and vibrant discussions and debates on one of the most important topics of our time, and indeed every time, peace. Right now, it's not really easy to talk about peace. We are living in very tense times in the world, where we see the number of conflicts growing with terrible consequences, not least for normal people. The horrendous events this weekend when Hamas launched an attack on Israel show us the constant need of peaceful solutions. The use of arms and terror fueled by hate and revenge will always, as I said, hurt innocent people the most, who have never chosen to become a target in the battlefield. And of course, we follow the developments in that region very closely, but sadly, I think we are already seeing escalations. Hopefully, we will not see more escalation, and hopefully diplomacy will prevail. As mentioned, we have here the Mayor of Lviv. Very warm welcome to you. Russia's illegal and terrible invasion into Ukraine has now lasted for almost 20 months, upset the lives of millions of people, but it has also shaken the international security policies worldwide and shaken the system created over 70 years ago to prevent wars from happening again after the Second World War. I had the experience and the honor to visit Kiev earlier this year, and it is for us here in Iceland, which is regularly chosen the most peaceful country in the world, an experience never to be forgotten to visit a country that is at war and experience what really it means to be at war. And therefore I say it's not easy to talk about peace at times when the world is really fraught with war, conflict, and tension. But as I say, maybe never more important. Dear guests, social stability is the foundation for peace. Peace is the foundation for social stability. And sadly, we are confronted with grave issues that undermine social stability in numerous countries, thereby threatening the prospects for lasting peace and prosperity. We see the profound effects of the climate crisis around the world, where people's homes and livelihoods are destroyed. It is predicted that we will see increased strife over natural resources, land, water, and crops. So therefore, decisive climate action is also an action for peace. We are also faced with the fact that democracy is under threat, with increased polarization that can fuel hate and isolation between groups. And we have been observing in the last few years democratic backslide with restrictions of hard-earned rights, even in mature democratic countries. And growing inequalities, not only within countries, but also between countries, continue to be a grave challenge and a destabilizing force. And I also must mention the systematic violation of women's rights, which is what we can call a red thread in two major human rights crises in the world today, in Afghanistan and in Iran. The Nobel Committee decided last Friday to award Narges Mohammadi the Nobel Peace Prize for her fight against oppression and for women's rights in Iran. And I solidly support the call for her immediate release from prison, so she will be free to receive the Nobel Prize in person in Oslo in December. We actually held an event on the status of women in Afghanistan during the UN General Assembly last month, the Icelandic government, in collaboration with UN Women, where actually we talked about gender persecution and gender apartheid. And let's not forget that war and conflict is often a shelter for horrendous sexual violence and crimes. We have seen that happen in Ukraine for the last 20 months, something that we do not talk sufficiently about, but is a real threat to women. To all those challenging circumstances, international solidarity and cooperation is the key, or at least that is what we found out after the Second World War when we implemented the multilateral system in its form that we know it today. But we also know that it takes a lot of work and a huge effort to maintain that multilateral system. For Iceland, being a small country which relies on that countries around us and in the globe respect international rules and laws, follow the international order, we are very much aware what it means when countries systematically break those orders. So we are firm spokespersons of multilateralism, which is our best way to meet and resolve those tasks, because we cannot have a world where might is always right. In December, we will celebrate the 75 years anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and at the same time, we need to safeguard international law and institutions, promote general respect for multilateral agreements, also on disarmament. Even though Iceland is a very clear country for the international order, the rules-based international order with the UN at its core, we know it's not perfect, but it's by far superior to the world of war, chaos, and lawlessness that the breakdown of multilateral cooperation entails. This conference here is part of our chairmanship in the Nordic cooperation. And as all of you know, the Nordic countries have a strong history of close cooperation and shared values based on respect for welfare, democracy, and respect for the rule of law and human rights. And we have also been strong advocates for peace and important actors of peaceful action on the international arena. As I said, our presidency has revolved around the importance of peace in every aspect of society, because without peace we cannot have any welfare, we cannot have any progress, we cannot do any meaningful climate action without peace. And countries at war know this best. The aim of this conference is to bring together creative thinkers to engage in an intergenerational dialogue on how we can strengthen the Nordic cooperation for peace, but also how we can strengthen international cooperation for peace. Because all states, big and small, can and should use their voice, means, and experience to contribute to address against warfare, conflict, and grave humanitarian crisis. In times of conflict and war, it can indeed be complicated to talk about peace, but never as important. Let's remember really the slogan of this forum, the Imagine Forum. Peace was also something that only could be imagined when that song was written. So it has never been as important, but we also must realize that it is complicated when we see the rise in the number of conflicts in the world, and often very complicated conflicts. But peace is a precondition for process. It's a precondition for making progress in the SDGs that we have all united for. And therefore, I think this is a very important topic to talk about openly and hopefully see some solutions. Thank you very much.
Deputy Secretary General, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, and dear friends. Good morning, and I repeat the warm welcome of my Prime Minister to all of you. During the next 2 days, we will be discussing the concept of peace from different angles. Peace is a topic that is of fundamental importance for the well-being and prosperity of humankind. Now, when peace in Europe is threatened in a way that we have not witnessed since the end of the Second World War, it is pertinent that we heighten and intensify the focus on peace in the political arena. Peace and security, harmony and lack of conflict, these are the basic components for living a good life that every human being longs for. But for many, it is a distant dream, or even only a mere vision, something that they have only heard of, but have never in their lives experienced. And more children are born into a reality of that kind. This conference is an important part of the presidency of Iceland in the Nordic Council of Ministers this year. Iceland decided that in light of the serious deterioration of peace and security situation in the West since February last year, we could really not run the presidency without addressing the great threats to peace that we are now witnessing. The illegal invasion war in Ukraine and its wide-ranging consequences come on top of instability and conflict in other regions of the world that have become the main drivers of rising hunger and humanitarian needs. The horrendous reports of the outbreak of war between the Hamas group in Palestine and Israel make today's discussions even more relevant. Such circumstances make the solidarity and the cooperation of the Nordic nations vitally important, in my opinion. The Nordic region has collectively emerged at the international level as messengers of peace and strong proponents of international agreements on peace and disarmament. And my friends, we must continue doing so. The aim of this conference is to highlight the importance of peace as the foundation for human rights, for welfare, for women's rights, and environmental protection. And then to connect this to our Nordic emphasis in our country's future's vision as the world's most sustainable and most integrated region. The war in Ukraine has shown us in a brutal way how easy it was to disrupt the hard-won peace in Europe that was brought about after the Second World War. As we have witnessed over and over again, war can break out overnight, but peace is fragile and elusive, it takes both enormous effect and a long time to win it back. Now, during these conference days, we aim to shed a light on the global consequences of conflict and unrest. And it goes without saying that in war, there will be innocent victims, women in particular, children, people with disabilities, and other groups that are already marginalized, and therefore more vulnerable socially. In times of war, their plight will be multiplied and have an even stronger effect on the personal situation, as well as making them an easy target of violence and war crimes. In my mind, peace is always the prerequisite for human rights, especially women's rights, for social stability, and for environmental protection. Because like war, climate change also results in social unrest. It results in migration, in displacement and human tragedy. These therefore go hand in hand, and I think we should discuss it in that way. Now, during Iceland's presidency, we want to emphasize that matters of peace should really be one of the cornerstones of Nordic cooperation. In that context, I would also like to emphasize that the collaboration between peace centers and research institutes in the Nordic region must be made more visible, and the good work that is being carried out there should receive a higher profile. I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to the Nordic peace institutions for helping to set up a very exciting program for tomorrow's sessions. Dear friends, our mission is peace, and our work here is important towards that end. And on that note, it is my distinct privilege to introduce Ms. Amina J Mohammed, a distinguished global leader who currently holds the esteemed position of Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. And she also serves as the chair of the United Nations Sustainable Development Group. Ms. Mohammed's illustrious career has been marked by her unwavering dedication to sustainable development, environmental protection, and social justice. She began her career on the international arena as Minister for the Environment in the Federal Republic of Nigeria, where she spearheaded her country's initiatives in climate action and the preservation of the natural environment. However, her impact extends far beyond her home nation. In 2012, Ms. Mohammed joined the United Nations as a special advisor to the former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, where she assumed a pivotal role in shaping the global development agenda. She led the charge in crafting the historic 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and played a key role in the formulation of the Sustainable Development Goals, setting the world on a path towards a more equitable and sustainable future. I am privileged to call upon you here. The floor is yours, Ms. Mohammed.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I have two incredible sisters, the Prime Minister of Iceland and, of course, the Minister of Cooperation, Minister of International Development for Norway. But our host today, too, our Minister for the Nordic Cooperation, the Minister of Social Affairs and Labour Market of Iceland. Excellencies, many, many friends, ladies and gentlemen, it really is a pleasure to join you here today. Very grateful to the government and the people of Iceland for hosting us and for Iceland's consistent voice in the support of peace, of dignity and sustainable development. And I think the highlight of my 2.5-day trip was my conversation with young Icelandic girls and women for development. There is quite clearly no peace without sustainable development, and there's certainly no development without peace, and there's neither development nor peace without the respect for human rights. The Nordic nations have long been promoters of peace, supporters of sustainable development, and champions of multilateralism. You've been a part of the UN family since its earliest days, and you have helped to maintain peace far from your shores, you showed that the rule of law and good governance are the bedrock of a just society. And you've come together to advance human rights and alleviate suffering around the world, especially for women and children, who often bear the brunt of conflicts and war. Today, that leadership role is more important than ever. The world is in the midst of multiple crises that feed off each other, inflame one another, and create conditions in which conflict can ignite and spread across borders. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has caused immense suffering for Ukrainians, and it has pushed up food and energy prices around the world. That has certainly gone across borders. As I was traveling to Iceland, the horrendous conflict between Israel and Palestine has taken center stage again, with tragic consequences. We are facing a full-blown war again. Civilians are the main victims, women, the elderly, children. And the Secretary General has called for the immediate release of all citizens that have been abducted from Israel. He's urging for diplomatic efforts to avoid a wider conflagration of and a focus on peace and negotiations around that two-state solution. We must stop the human suffering and embrace peace. The sad reality is that violence and conflict are on the rise, with impacts reversing development gains across the world, trampling on women's rights. Neighbors of Sudan, like Chad, for example, I was there 3 weeks ago, under immense pressure from the breakdown in cross-border trade, combined with a flow of over 1 million refugees in the space of a month. This is such a poor country, giving so much with so little. Terrorism is gaining a stronger foothold in the Sahel, exploiting the climate crisis for its own ends and doing everything it can to undermine democratic governance. In the Sahel and beyond, changing weather patterns are conspiring with rapid urban expansion in ways that are overwhelming traditional governance mechanisms, which had previously managed to ensure harmonious relations between farmers and herders for generations. It is now clear that we continue to fight for peace on earth, but we must also seek peace with nature. The world has fought nature for too long. It's now fighting back with extreme consequences in the weather that we see, from Pakistan through Spain to Hawaii and many other places. No country is spared. Meanwhile, our economic engine rooms are failing to deliver the decent and dignified jobs that give hope to our youth and address the root causes of conflict. For the first time in a generation, the number of people in extreme poverty has risen. A record number of people are being forced from their homes. Hunger is growing, a result of conflict, COVID, climate, and inequality. And many developing nations are drowning in debt and facing financial catastrophe, fiscal deficits that do not allow them to pay for health, to pay for education. Excellencies and friends, these great challenges of our times have two common themes. First, they are born of exclusion, of leaving people behind. And second, they require multilateral solutions. Each of the major issues we face goes beyond the ability of any single nation to manage. Yet at this time, when international cooperation is most needed, it is also threatened. Growing geopolitical divides are putting multilateralism under extreme stress and strain. Our international institutions today are out of date, in particular the United Nations Security Council, that reflects the world as it was 80 years ago, and not the world of today. And skepticism is rising, fueled by the anger stirred when the international community makes promises that it does not keep. The multilateral system, which has done so much to advance peace over the years, is fracturing. And that should worry all of us who care about peace. Excellencies, I see two important pathways forward, paths towards creating a peaceful future, an enabling environment for people and for our planet. First, we must double down on sustainable development. The Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, are our guiding principles for a better future. The world came together beyond member states, to civil society, to academia, to women, to business, to have a framing for what could give us a more peaceful and just and dignified life. They are our compass for inclusive prosperity and our best hope for achieving sustainable peace around the world, amongst people and with nature. Peace is one promise of the SDGs, but all the 17 goals are interconnected. Without sustainable development, peace will always be at risk. The goals speak directly to the root causes of conflict. It is only with inclusive, empowering education systems leading to dignified, decent jobs that recruitment efforts of terrorist organizations would fall on deaf ears. It is only with responsive, resilient state institutions that meet the needs and priorities and rights of all stakeholders that protect equal rights and ensure equal opportunities for all, and not least women and girls. Take Somalia, for example, where the UN is working hand in hand with the authorities under the Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework. Every step that we take to the fulfillment of the 2030 Agenda is a step towards resilience, security, rights, and prosperity. Every step we take together is a blow to all those who try to force us apart. And so we must implement the 2030 Agenda with its entirety to address the inequalities that fuel conflict, be they economic, social, environmental, intergenerational, political, or barriers that continue to limit the participation of women. Yet the SDGs and climate commitments are today dangerously off track. Halfway to the 2030 deadline, we've only reached 15% of our targets, and the annual SDG financing gap in developing countries stands at almost $4 trillion annually. Countries burdened with unsustainable debt, facing financial ruin, simply can't afford to invest in the SDGs, basic rights for everyone. If we continue at this rate, we fail, and it's as simple as that. The SDGs do need an urgent rescue plan, and it is why the SDG Summit was a centerpiece of this year's UN General Assembly High-Level Week, and I'm pleased to say that it resulted in a powerful political declaration, which was very fragile at many points. In fact, it was only just agreed on the morning of the summit, and that several national and global commitments were announced, including from Nordic nations. Thanks to the steadfast support of Nordic countries and other key champions, the UN continues to strengthen its offer of support to member states that are in transition to a sustainable future, so that we do make the goals a reality. The political declaration adopted at the summit called for an improved international debt mechanism, an urgent voluntary rechanneling of special drawing rights, all to enable more fiscal space so that we can attend to the rights of people. It declared support for reform of the international financial architecture, an architecture designed in 1945, surely 75 years later. We must acknowledge that that shelf life has expired. And it welcomed the Secretary-General's call for an SDG stimulus, speaking to ministers of finance, of $500 billion a year to address the SDG financing gap. Together, we must turn these commitments into reality. We must invest in development. And to achieve this, the Secretary-General has called for a leaders group to really help to deliver a set of clear steps that practically can get us a SDG stimulus flowing by 2024, fueling development and not conflict. He has urged this month's annual meetings of the multilateral development banks to see recapitalization and urgent rechanneling of our 100 billion SDRs. We will be there to pass these messages on this week. And so we ask all of you to consider these in support. These are the tools, these are the instruments that we do have to deal with the root causes of conflict, but also to invest in those transitions to peace. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the second path I see towards future peace and prosperity is reinvigorating our multilateral system. For almost 80 years, the multilateral system anchored in the United Nations Charter has been a beacon of hope in addressing global challenges. It has saved lives, it has relieved suffering, continues to do so. It has played a pivotal role in averting a third world war, advancing socioeconomic progress, supporting decolonization, and brokering and keeping peace. And often, Nordic countries have been central to those efforts. And so it is incumbent upon us all to preserve this vital institution for generations to come, to protect the gains. But to do that, we will need also to recognize that while the glass is some full, it is also some empty. We need to reform and transform and revitalize our United Nations. I often refer to that as our global town hall for the global village, for we are connected in ways that we have never been connected before. And we need, therefore, to create a United Nations that is fit for the 21st century. It is fit for our youth of today, our future generations of tomorrow. Our common agenda proposed a summit of the future, which will take place next year. It'll be a moment for leaders like you in this room to recommit to international cooperation and ensure that the multilateral system is fit to face the challenges of today and of tomorrow. The outcome will be a pact for the future, which will set out commitments for a safer and a much more prosperous future. Ahead of the summit, the Secretary-General has presented Member States with a series of policy briefs for consideration, and I hope you will have time to reference them as you go through the meetings over the next 2 days. And I think one of the more important of the policy briefs is the new agenda for peace. It outlines a vision for how Member States can manage geopolitical competition and find pragmatic solutions to global problems that make our collective security system more effective. We have set out a comprehensive set of recommendations for prevention, managing and resolving conflicts, for eliminating nuclear weapons, to developing frameworks to prevent the weaponization of new technologies. It suggests maximizing the capacity and convening power of the UN to bridge geopolitical divides, and strengthening prevention at the national level by linking action for peace with progress on sustainable development. The new Agenda for Peace also suggests action to make peacekeeping much more nimble and more adaptable, more responsive. It presents ideas for how to ensure regional organizations, such as the African Union or ASEAN, have the financial resources that they need to conduct effective peace operations. And it offers a vision for the reform of global governance in peace and security, and that does include the long-awaited reform of the United Nations Security Council, so that it is in line with today's world, revitalizing the General Assembly and strengthening the Peace-Building Commission are also other efforts that must be made. The summit is less than 12 months away, and the negotiations of the Pact to the Future will begin imminently, in a year when we celebrate the 75 years of the UN Charter on Human Rights, in a year when we must remember that the UN Charter begins with we the people. We're urging all member states to work together to aim for ambition and reach agreement on these critical issues. It will always require compromise and genuine, courageous leadership in these difficult times. Business as usual is not an option. We must have those uncomfortable discussions because the solutions can only come out of a discussion and a debate over the realities, and then recognize that the aspirations of the Charter still we have not attained, but are possible. Nordic countries have a unique role to play. You can act as a bridge between North and South, between East and West, a champion on critical issues in negotiations, including the promotion of human rights and the empowerment of women and girls. There is a trust deficit. There are frustrations. But we need to be coming into a room where people are open to have those discussions, that we can agree to disagree, that we can embrace our diversity as a strength and not as a weakness. Time and time again, you have proven that small states can have a big voice and make huge contributions to the world. It was thanks to the voice of small states, for example, that so much progress was achieved in the law of the sea in the recent year. It is also thanks to small states that we are making progress on the Financing for Development agenda. Iceland was a co-facilitator in this process that did get us ambitious outcomes. The multilateral system belongs to all countries, and we must collectively find a way to make it fit for the future. This year's 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights is another opportunity to reconnect around common values that bind us together. the universality and the indivisibility of human rights. But may I also say the progressive attainment of human rights. Where you may have already been the benchmark for a race to the top, there are many yet to catch up. How can we help to accompany them on that rough road that will eventually get everyone their rights and leave no one behind? The Charter made human rights a central purpose of the organization because the founders understood that lasting peace depended on the fulfillment of the full spectrum of rights. And let us continue to underscore economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights. It is why the Secretary General has identified the Universal Declaration as the best prevention tool that we all have. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, the challenges we face, they are grave. Many people wake up to not knowing if they have a future the day after. But we do have the power and we have the resources to solve them and to build a more peaceful, prosperous future for all of humanity. It is at this critical moment that I urge us all to embrace the spirit of cooperation, of peace and solidarity that has animated the Nordic nations for so long, and to throw ourselves behind your collective efforts in building a world of prosperity, a world where no one is left behind, a world where multilateralism thrives once more. Excellencies, that is the recipe for peace. And so let's work together to imagine peace and make it happen. Thank you.
Madam Prime Minister, may I invite you to join us. Deputy Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ingólfur Bjarni Sigfússon. I'm an editor with a public broadcaster here in Iceland, RÚV, and I have the honor of moderating this fireside chat between the two power ladies here sat next to me. Glancing through the headlines this morning was not a happy task. We have 70+ wars. The Washington Post had an in-depth article about the countries which will become more or less inhabitable or are already inhabitable because the median heat is above 37 degrees on more days than it is not. The Economist had a map of the countries most likely to suffer a violent coup in Africa. Spiegel had an article about the number of asylum seekers in Europe reaching already a higher number than in the record year of 2016. I could go on, but it doesn't really look like a planet where peace is realistic. Is it realistic, or is it just something we need to talk about because we should talk about it?
We definitely have to do something about it. Recognizing our realities is really important, but also recognizing the players that need to be brought to the table in a manner that we can cross those bridges, we can bring the connections that are needed for peace to happen. Convening that is becoming more and more difficult. If we look at some of the conflicts that we have today, even some of the big issues around climate, it has been very difficult to bring those players that cause perhaps the most pain into the room. It has been difficult to have a conversation in the United Nations, and as I said, we said that's a global town hall. We're going into echo chambers where we like the sound of our voices, we sympathize and empathize with one another. But the level of the conflict, the level of our lack of investment in climate action that's taking us to a 3-degree world has not allowed us to come and have those conversations. We had conversations in the UN General Assembly. We had a climate ambition summit. And the ambition was met by the smallest of countries. But those countries who are responsible for over 82% of the emissions were not in the room. And when they did come into the room, they were not able to step up to those necessary commitments that they should have made. In the case of conflict, we have to recognize they're very different. The invasion of Ukraine is not the same as an unconstitutional change in West Africa, nor is it one of the aggression that you see in Myanmar against its people. And each one has to be taken where it's at and to be met with the full instruments and the resources that we have. Are we paying enough attention to that? Are we putting those tools on the table and calling for them to be utilized in a fair and a just way? No, if we would stop the wars and we would begin to address that pathway back to peace. So there's a lot for us to do. I'm hopeful because this forum, for one, is happening. And many other fora are beginning to recognize that we have to bring those uncomfortable conversations into one space. If you listen to the conversations that are happening today after the beginning of this horrendous conflict in Israel and Palestine, yes, there are those that are outraged and have very harsh views about what they see should happen, but you also find the voices saying, well, that's not going to get us peace. What we really need to do is to recognize that we did have a pathway to peace and to a two-state solution in Israel and Palestine. We need to get back to that discussion. And there needs to be a little bit more, I would say, honesty, integrity in these discussions that we're having. Courage to speak about perhaps what people think is sensitive or unspeakable or the elephant in the room. We do have to be far more pragmatic.
But I think, if I might add, that what Amina said about the echo chambers of the world, because even here in Iceland we have several echo chambers, groups that really don't understand each other in their own echo chambers. So think about the globe and all its echo chambers. And I think what we've been seeing in the last few years is really also the effect of increased polarization, not just within countries, but also between countries. So I think actually, because I was there in Paris 2016, when all of us felt so optimistic about what we were going to do in the climate crisis. And then we have seen really the struggle ever since to really make things happen, and not least when it comes to financing the actions. So I think, and hope, because the Climate Ambition Summit, it was a good summit, even though we did not have the bigger nations. But I do hope that the smaller nations can also push the big ones to more action when it comes to fighting the climate crisis, because that is also going to be a very huge factor in, promoting conflicts around the world.
One of the trends that we see is a erosion of democracy. Recent surveys have shown that, especially among younger people, apparently they have less faith, or at least consider democracy to be less of an important thing to consider. We see strongmen and populists gaining power all over the world, perhaps because they don't sit in fora like this, they just take action and do stuff. That is a challenge, certainly to the multilateral system. How do we tackle, how do those who believe in multilateral solution and democracy tackle that and provide results? If we start with you.
Well, I think we have to go back to basics. Governance in any country should be about that social contract between the people, those that are governed and those that are governing them, leaders. Leaders that understand that their first responsibility is to the rights of their people. We use democracy as a framing for how to get that done. Three powerful parts, three pillars of it, where institutions are important, parliaments are important, justice is important. And there's not been the investment we should have had in those institutions that would then carry a process that includes and delivers results in people's lives. That erosion, I think, is the result that you see in those that vote are not young people. They don't believe in this governance. The social contract is being torn. It is being undermined. Sadly, it's across the world. So those that have promoted democracy, and it has worked for them for a time, are suddenly also finding it fracturing. So it's not democracy from my humble point of view that is the problem. The problem is the model and how we exercise leadership in providing democracy. In some cases, as we see when I look at my continent and I see the unconstitutional changes, much of that is in response to an environment where people see that they need to bring back to themselves a sense of discipline, safety, security, and then they go back, to celebrate the military. I mean, that has to tell you that something is very wrong with the governance system in those countries. And it is a wake-up call. There are discussions and debates right now about what is causing this. I think everyone agrees that they want to go back to constitutional laws that protect the rights of people and deliver. But that journey back is going to take considerable work. I think today too that, you know, with technology, it is far more difficult to get through a democratic process, an election, with what technology does to undermine that. It's a fantastic opportunity to be connected, but we see the abuse of technology in elections, in eroding the trust of those that are governing and those that are governed. So there's a lot of work to do. I hope that what we can do is involve young people in how we reframe this, because I think we do have to have that discussion. It's going to be about their future now, and we have to explain. It's very difficult to explain some leadership today, that a democratic process put in place what is clearly not the leader of the people. This disconnect is something that we have to get back to, and we have to have discussions country by country, across regions, the power of the convening of the UN to still bring us back to the core of the values that we have in the Charter.
But I think also we cannot talk about democracy without talking about the other factors that go with democracy. And then I'm talking about human rights, for example. I'm talking about equality. I'm talking really about the framework that the world has united around in the SDGs, where we think about the welfare of the people, where we have that clear goal of not leaving anyone behind. Because if you live in a world where you don't have equality, where you don't experience that people enjoy general human rights, it's very difficult to talk about democracy. So I think we need to have this holistic picture when we talk about democracy. And I agree, there is a growing audience for the strong men who simply say, get things done. But I think also that we will see the pendulum swing, because with democracy we have those rights, those freedoms, which we have seen actually taken away from people just overnight, but which is really the groundwork for a good society. Now, Iceland has focused a lot on democracy. We did that during our chairmanship in the Council of Europe earlier this year. Democracy, human rights, and the international order. And I think, as I said in my speech here before, for a small country, I think we really realize the value of those important things and the context in which they are all bound. And then at one point on technology, with AI and new technologies and digitalization of really the political debate, we are seeing not just, I think we could say it's one of the biggest changes we have seen in political debate for centuries. Because things move in such so fast that it is really difficult to have an in-depth discussion these days when technology controls really so much of the debate. You know, medium is the message, was said one, and we might think about that these days.
You've addressed the weakness of the multilateral system and the institutions that make up the multilateral system. And okay, so those need to be reformed. But how do you do that under these circumstances? How do you reform a system that needs to be active right now? How do you deliver results to people in conflict zones who are suffering the consequences of climate change, who are scared and hungry and don't have a lot of time for debate and process? How do you meld those two things so they work? Maybe you start with Katrín now.
Well, I mentioned the Council of Europe. Obviously, that is a smaller body than the UN. so I must admire what Amina and her colleagues are doing every day at the UN with the whole world at the table. But the Council of Europe, I thought it was actually a very important project for Iceland, because we were dealing with very serious issues. And then I'm talking about invasion of Russia into Ukraine and the result of that summit that was held here in Reykjavik, which is the registry of damages, damage done by Russia and Ukraine, which is about accountability and the fact that if you actually violate sovereignty and territorial integrity, you have to be held accountable. And I think we have some examples of multilateral collaboration where we actually see that things can happen. I mentioned the Paris Agreement, which inspired optimism around the world. Obviously, I think it's very important what will happen next, not just at the COP this December. Maybe the good thing there is that everybody's so pessimistic that something actually good might come out of it. But we also have the Summit of the Future next year, and I think that is going to be a very important summit for the globe, because there we will really take a stand to where we want to move on.
Mm-hmm.
How do you reform a multilateral institution, especially if it involves some of those pillars of those institutions having to give up power because the world has changed?
Well, power's never given up, right? You will have to negotiate it, negotiate those spaces to say that we will be in a better world if we concede some of that power for the greater good of all. You've got to find a vested interest in doing that. And I think that we have to put on front, at the core of it, yes, our human rights and the rule of law, but accountability, and there have to be checks and balances, that you are held to account, that you cannot get away with the kind of atrocities that we've seen people get away with nothing to account for. And then to see the double standards, that where you're able to get accountability, you exact the maximum accountability response there. And then in others, you get away with it. So the world starts to become more fractured in doing so. And I think that has to come back. We need to have common ground where we all agree. And it's there. I don't think that it's not there, but we have to reinforce that and come back to have those conversations. But I do think that this is not a question of human rights and women's rights. It's a question of common sense, that you need the other half of the world at the table. And without women's leadership, this is just unusual that we sit on this stage. On most stages, it's just men. It's still just men. Doesn't matter where you go in the world. We looked at many of those panels that we saw in the United Nations. And it wasn't because we didn't try to get a women and man panel. It was because voted into office, voted into a boardroom were men. And there were no women at the table. Women bring value. They don't take away your jobs or your space, but they bring something else in there that perhaps is a reason why when people say a man-made climate event, you need to underscore the man, because in the decision-making of fossil fuel companies, of the way in which we consume and that we produce, most of these decisions are made by men. And if you bring women into this, you will have a decision that will look at the whole community, as we look at the whole family. I mean, we're wired differently, but together we will go further. If we look at the war in Ukraine, we are speaking about winning a war. But where are the conversations about the pathways to peace? And where are the women at the table that are having those discussions with the men? And we're not saying exclude, we're saying bring those voices in. So I think women's leadership is more than ticking a box. It is results. I don't know yet a woman leader that has not delivered on results. And if it's that they deliver less, I'm not sure that men don't do worse, because in many of the cases, we would not be in the position that we are in. And so we have to take a hard look at what are the barriers for allowing, that prevent women from coming into those spaces, and to have a better conversation with men. I mean, I also think that we feminists often have conversations in our own echo chamber, because we've assumed through various academic work and research where men are on all of this. But I think we need to have a better human conversation where men and women and the intergenerational piece comes in. Because if I look to see how we speak about the future, there's not much of the future who will take those leadership roles there. And so
I think there actually were fewer women leaders at the UN General Assembly this year than last year. So it's not just that we are moving backwards on whole when it comes to the SDG on gender equality. I think we see it also in the leadership roles. And it's just crazy. It is, because, we should have thought when it's 2023 that we would be there. But now that it's nearly 300 years estimated until we get full gender equality in the world. So all of us will be dead then, and probably all our children too.
We have to want to see it.
And probably the grandchildren too. So it's quite a long wait for half of humanity.
we have to want to see at the table those that can bring solutions, regardless of what gender they are.
Exactly.
And I think that if we do that, we will see, women and men at the table. We've seen this today in my country that's pretty conservative in many parts of it, Nigeria. You'll hear men saying that women deliver better. My daughters are doing better because they were given that chance. Or they will point to myself and say, well, you see, this is what happens when you put a woman in decision making. So I think, we also need the men to look around and see the value. You need to see us, you need to hear us, and you need to value us. And that doesn't matter whether in the boardroom, in a multilateral setting, even in a situation of conflict, of war. See us, and we take the brunt of it. Wars may be over, and we may lose our men in these wars. We lose women as well. But the scars of wars that live with women, that live with children, that live with some men, they go on for a lifetime. And so we need to be at that table to redefine what we mean by attaining peace. And at what cost? At what cost do we attain that peace?
You gave me the keyword intergenerational. We have some questions. We want to take some questions from the room. Before any of you raise your hands, we've actually picked out the people to ask them. Because we want
very democratic.
Very democratic, because we want to give voice to young people and get questions from some of the younger members of the audience. So let me start by mentioning Anne Elizabeth Jensdóttir. Where are you? And there should be a microphone for you.
Here it is.
Yes.
Is it on?
We need to. There's no sound. So.
It's not on. Is it? Yes,
Yeah.
it is. Thank you so much for passing me the floor. I have a somewhat sensitive but also important question to you. Western countries, such as the Nordic countries, have a long history of imposing their views and way of life on the global south. Sometimes with the best of intentions, sometimes with the worst. Nonetheless, the consequences have often been devastating. How do we ensure that the Nordic countries' development aid policies don't become a continuation of colonialism by other means?
Well, that's an easy question. Where do we start with that? Katrín, do you want to?
Well, I think it is really a complicated question and it's no simple answer. And if we take an example from Iceland, where we have, because we were talking about gender equality, we have focused on gender equality in our developmental collaboration. Obviously, that is a value that we value very greatly, but we also firmly believe that it is a universal human right that should apply everywhere. So I think when dealing with that, so we are not actually continuing to acting in the same way as was done in the 19th century, really. I think we have to value all the different factors, because obviously these trends can be found in development collaboration, that Western values are imposed on the global south. But we also must think about which values is something that the world has actually united around. And therefore, I talk a lot about the SDGs because I firmly believe that they are not part of imposing values. Those are the values that we have actually united around as a world. So I think, therefore, that is a pact that I truly believe that should be our guiding lines, not just in development collaboration, but in everything we're doing. I know they are abstract and people find them very distant. And they say, what does it matter to us in Iceland, what the SDGs are all about, But it's really because it's one humankind. And even though we're at a different place, I think we all can find it very useful to use those goals as a guiding light for what we're doing. But I think it's a sensitive question, and I think you probably could find some examples about Western values being imposed upon the global south during this, through development collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Oof. Okay, so coming from a colonized nation, I think that it's very important we remember history. In trying to accommodate those core values, We did have, and still have, the Charter of Human Rights.
Yeah.
I think it's well to remember that many countries were still colonized when the declaration was signed. And that as we have progressed, do we own it? And I think we do, but perhaps it's not apparent. And we own it in our constitutions. So I think when you come into a conversation with developed and developing countries, important to make the emphasis of one's constitution, and so that your human rights are right in front of you in your countries with leaders that need to deliver them, and that the Charter in Geneva is the benchmark of where the world comes together and agrees we're one, and we're one on a set of core values. I think over the years, probably those core values, as different countries have had the ability to develop, we have layered more and more and more. We lost the core. We left people behind in traveling on some of those core values and rights for women, gender, and so now we see the tensions. It is a complex question to answer. You can't answer it one way. And I think that today, when we have those conversations, the rights that we hold on to are indivisible. But there's also something that we said about them, they're progressive. So they're journeys that we need to take with people, with countries. And I think where you have had that experience of getting to the top, then you need to bring people along. And in bringing people along, you don't drag them. You don't force people, because you might get them to the destination and then you'll regress and wonder why, you know, the next day you can't get agreement and you've gone back and you'll say we've lost ground on rights. Well, you never had them. So it's really important to embrace them. There's a lot of unconscious bias. And so we find that on different levels, even today when I'm sitting at the table and I'm chairing a meeting, the unconscious bias at the table says that what is this woman first, and woman from the South doing at the head of this table with many other men and women from the North? And you suddenly see a conversation happening in front of you without you. You have to say, hello, DSG, the Deputy Secretary General, it's me. And it's not that it's deliberate. You just said unintentional. It is unintentional, but it has to be called out so that we can right those wrongs. The same happens with our education system. Our education system is one that has been colonized. It is an education system that's not grown from inside of countries, that's taken the value of religion, of traditions, of culture. Not all culture and traditions are bad. That you may not agree with them, but you've got to travel with people through all of this. And if I use two extremes where we have extreme views on them from developed and developing countries, I'll take polygamy. We have laws, and it works for many countries in the developing world. We've not got to a stage where we will say, no, it's a monogamous marriage that we want, or a partnership that we want. And so people need to understand how that works. And that why are younger people today in many of our countries saying, well, that's what we prefer? Do they have agency to project that and to protect that because that is their way? Or you have the LGBTQI communities for many countries who have not been able to digest that. And are they right, are they wrong? We have to travel till we get to where this diversity that we have in our world today is that fabric with threads that are also important and that are the strength that we must embrace. So I think we still have a way to go on anything, but can you open up the space to have that discussion? It is uncomfortable. We should be able to agree to disagree. And on the things that do harm, we have to come together to deal with those and find the solutions for it. I have a lot of hope because I see in many discussions where we've been courageous enough to bring difficult issues to the table that we've been able to have conclusions that have actually seen champions come from where you least expect it to push those issues because there are better understanding. There is more empathy with what the sufferings of people are as a result of those rights being denied. And it's not always a question that we're apparent about. And I think this is where the echo chambers, we need to come out of them. Technology, you know, again, How can we have a conversation that is more inclusive? How can we find solutions to these that everyone can live with? And you know, that's a world where there is solidarity in looking for the dignity in life. Everybody must be dignified. Their ways of life. Just hearing about, I'm from a herder family. So herders and farmers, it is the root cause of it is our inability to have recognized that urbanization happens, and that with that more food is needed, and with that you need to go back to these two important communities that actually have a symbiotic relationship to see how do we work out the land issue, the grazing issue, the livelihoods, how do we move a generation of herders into ranching, how do we look at farmers who will you know, see the value of their compatriots as they've worked out in life. This is difficult. And when it's not attended to, you will have conflict. It may be exacerbated by climate change, but ultimately it is a lack of leadership to provide the space for both urbanization to happen, food to be provided, and people's lives and livelihoods to be honored.
Thank you. We have another question from Joshua Gabriel Davidsson, who is the Icelandic representative to the UNR.
Thank you. So although we might pass laws, human rights laws with the best of intention, they might not always have the effect that we imagined and can sometimes even backfire. And sometimes we can also see some fluctuations in cultures. For example, you can see some conflict bubbling up with the LGBTQIA here in Iceland, for example, and also overnight in, for example, Israel-Palestine conflict now in Gaza over the weekend. So what are the major challenges that hinder the effectiveness of human rights laws, and what are ways of overcoming these and these fluctuations that we see?
I think first things first, you have to respect the rights of everyone, recognize them, include them, and we have to have these conversations from the lowest level of our existence, which is in your family, in your community, in your society. Having this top-down doesn't work. The conversations that are happening now on Israel and Palestine is that, you know, we have to remember every life is valuable. And if we do that and we start from that point, we begin to look for the solutions to protect those lives and to stop the consequences of two sides that look not to find the solutions. Again, it's about leadership. But leadership doesn't have to start from the top down. It should, but you know, we can change that from within, and you know, that voice needs to count. It is going back to why would Iceland's voice count when perhaps the prevailing leadership is in the P5? Well, once you bring your voice to the table on what is right, and you gain a momentum around that right, then you for sure will see that bigger powers begin to buckle. And we've seen that on climate. We've seen that from Barbados that argued the financial consequences of excluding small nations and bring some of those clauses to the fore that were approved by the IMF, and now see the protection of those nations through climate justice. So you do have voices that can start from the very smallest space into the arena where rights are abused, where people's lives are taken for granted. But it is so important. Recognize people's views. As I say, we may disagree with many of them, but if we hear them and engage them, you can begin to have a conversation. I walked into Afghanistan for one reason alone. Let's not forget about the women and girls of Afghanistan. I was not going to win you know, Hayatullah in Kandahar saying he's reversing everything because Amina Mohammed landed in Afghanistan. But what we did was to amplify the voices of the women there. They don't want us to make up their voices, they just want us to amplify them and to have robust discussions with the leadership of the Taliban, in which I could remind them that there are laws within the Quran, within the Hadith, that they are trampling over. And today we are still open in that discussion. We will have a debate on women in Islam in the next 2 weeks. So I think that you have to hang on to to the rights and the truth and your convictions, and keep pushing until they're achieved. We are in a world where the realities are pretty miserable, but the aspirations of all those instruments we put there, I think Karen just said this, on the SDGs, are amazing. So we need to want to achieve them and not to reinvent them. They're there, but let's try to close the gap between what is and what should be.
But it's so odd, really, because if you think about the progress, you know, because obviously loads of progress have been made in the world for the last 100 years, even though we started this morning a little bit bleakly. You know, if we think about it, so much has happened. And how has that happened? It has happened through dialogue. And therefore, you sometimes wonder, why do not everybody see this? Why do not everybody realize that real progress is only made through dialogue, and respectful dialogue, and try to create understanding, because in the end, it's all about humans. And they are, of course, different, but still very much the same. So I think if we really think about what has worked, dialogue is the tool that has worked. Amina mentioned small countries, and they have done an amazing, really, job in really raising their flag when it comes to climate action. And I admire not least the small island states that have raised that flag and spoken very loudly and actually made some very important changes through their through what they have been saying. And the same can also be said about the people living around the Arctic, because we're going to talk about the Arctic here in this house in just a few days' time at the Arctic Circle. And I think always the most important people there at that conference are the people who are actually living around the Arctic. And they have been saying, all very good that you are talking about the Arctic and the opportunities that are there, but we want to be there to talk about it. So I think when you really are pessimistic, you also must remember that progress has truly been made, and dialogue has always been the tool which has made that progress.
That light, that tower, that light that we see there is hope. I mean, it's the one commodity that the UN has, and that's the one we propagate. Because without it, then why are we sitting in this room? We must remain hopeful. The fact that both of us women are sitting on this stage is hopeful. Because from us, you know, hopefully many more women will stand on our shoulders, and they will be more women and more leaders that are women like yourself, for which we're incredibly proud.
Well, I think that's a good note to stop on. I know we have to come to a hard stop because you are both very busy and have to be somewhere entirely else in about 10 minutes' time. But it's also good to end on a slightly more optimistic note than we started at. I guess that's as good as we'll get today. I want to thank my distinguished panelists, Katrín Jakobsdóttir, Amina J Mohammed. Let's give them both a...
To be continued. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.